So let's see, everybody. It appears from information that I've been given this afternoon that United States Senator Chuck Schumer has withdrawn support or even cut the federal funding, the federal assistance dollars for the new Lake George sewage treatment plant. Now, the sewage treatment plant is a story that's intrinsically, intricately connected to the flushing of Lake George. For decades, the Lake George Park Commission, the Department of Environmental Conservation, has been flushing large amounts of sewage contaminated and chemical contaminated water out of Lake George by repeatedly engaging in wintertime environmental flushes of Lake George at Weedville down the Lachute River. The bottom line is, with all the lakefront septic systems, there's thousands of camps and homes on the lakefront of Lake George. There's motels and other larger restaurant-type businesses over in the east side, up on the west side, just all over the lake that use septic systems. Now, here's where the rubber meets the road on this sewage leachate fouled lake. The Glens Falls banks, the banks down in Albany, have been selling lakefront properties with these septic systems for decades. The reality is the banks and the real estate companies have made a fortune off of selling those lakefront properties with septic systems. In other words, the people that made the most money by enabling the septic systems in the first place are some of the wealthiest people in New York, especially both of the Glens Falls banks. Now, I think that the Glens Falls banks, particularly Arrow Financial Corporation, has an obligation to foot a lot of the bill for the prevention of sewage leachate, leaching from the leach fields, from the septic tanks, into Lake George. Now, just as a matter of fact, I grew up on the Harris Bay Marina. My parents built back in the 1950s and early 1960s. The swamp, East Shores Harbor, today known as the Harris Bay Yacht Club. That's 600 acres at the bottom of Harris Bay, and the other acreage at the bottom of Van Wormer's Bay, or what some people call Warner Bay, was owned by the Witham family. During my years as a young teenager until about the age of 21 or so, I worked for a number of the contractors that built lakefront homes. John Matthews, Olaf Ronnie, Dean Howland, Alger Mason, amongst others. The reality of the lakefront cottage and home industry is that the septic systems are just like the camps and the houses. They sit on bedrock. There is no leach field that's not leaching into Lake George. So, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, the Lake George Park Commission, and the Lake George Park Association know damn well that all that up and down with the mill pond, the flushing of the toilet on Lake George into the Lachute River is a reality. The Post-Star and the Albany Times-Union and the Troy Record and the Lake George Mirror and the Adirondack Almanac and every other newspaper from the New York Times to the Montreal Sentinel that has ever written about the up and down, up and down, up and down water conditions on Lake George need to understand that the practice known as dilution is the solution to pollution, has been being practiced by New York State for decades. They're diluting the lake with runoff and rainwater so that the lake doesn't go emerald green. The diminished water quality in Lake George is directly traceable to the up and down, up and down, up and down flushing of the mill pond, which I've been writing about for quite some time. This is the Judson Rhythm Challenge to every government official and agent, and every resident that lives on the Lake George Basin. Let's discuss it with Old Man Witham. Let's see what that kid from Harris Bay really knows. And that's going to the publishers of the Post-Star. They seem to have a camaraderie with the Lake George Association, and there's a problem there. The Lake George Association are some of the most guilty parties to the pollution of the lake that exists. Most of the membership of the Lake George Association, they're the ones whose septic tanks are leaking into the lake. And it's just, it's a sad fact. It's pathetic, but it's the truth. So the Post-Star needs to sit down and talk to somebody who really knows what's going on that lake. And I guess the last thing I'll say here is that in the 1960s, I remember plugging a lot of boats so that they couldn't dump their sewage into Lake George. My mother and father wouldn't allow them across the launching ramp. My mother and father wouldn't hook them up on the travel lift and put their boats in Lake George until their blackwater system, their wastewater systems were plugged. Dad wouldn't let them in the lake. So talk about your swamp fox warrior for Lake George. Well, that would have been my dad and my mother. The Witham family. There's a lot of other families in the history of Lake George besides those that belong to the Lake George Association. And I want to send a message out to the lawyer that represents the Lake George Fund. Why in the hell should the taxpayers pick up the tab for what the Glens Falls banks did? Why should the taxpayers of New York State and of the United States pay huge sums of money to fix problems for the millionaires that live on Lake George? Tom West. Now, I know that might seem a little unfair, but I can't go dumping sewage in Lake George without paying a great big fine and probably going to jail. Ask Dave Wick and Mr. Smith over there at the Lake George Park Commission. It's just that simple. Ask Basil Sagos. Can Judson Witham come to Lake George and build a septic system that leaks into Lake George? And the answer is, well, of course not. But I will tell you one thing before I end this video. This guy right here, I grew up on Lake George, and I worked for most all of the contractors that built those septic systems. And I know the bedrock conditions in that lake basin very well. And I also know that in the fissures and the cracks in the ledge rock, the bedrock along the lake, that stuff goes right down into the springs and feeds into the lake through the springs. There shouldn't be any septic systems on Lake George. The bedrock doesn't permit it. Now, last thing said, you take a look at who made billions off of the profits from selling all those lakefront mansions and homes and cottages. Take a look at who got rich. And that would be your local gangster banksters. Let the gangster banksters and their insurance companies, who also make a fortune off of that market, and the real estate companies. How many real estate companies sold all those septic systems to the public knowing damn well, Mr. Stowe, however you say your name, how many of the real estate companies on Lake George sold those camps and homes and mansions to the millionaires knowing damn well those septic tanks leak into the lake? And that's for every real estate company operating in the lake basin. The realtors, the bankers, they all got filthy rich, and now they want the taxpayers to fix the problem. And I think that's dead wrong. I think it's as dead wrong as what was done to Clifford and Anita Witham, with that up and down, up and down, up and down ice sheet when they're flushing the lake in the winter and in the spring. It destroyed the Witham Marina year after year after year after year. And the historical records, the government's records, and millions of witnesses know that good old Judson Witham is absolutely correct. So folks, I'm going to leave it right there and look for all the links below. There's plenty of links below. And please, if you got any input, send me a comment or two. I'd love to hear from you. And as always, hasta la vista, God bless, and you betcha, we're coming back.